Um, so one great result that comes out of using pivot points is we can make a snap decision, which is pretty reliable, in which we can trust our own judgment even when the cards go against us and we lose the all-in. We can know confidently that was probably the right decision. So, in my mind, pivot points are really almost like cheating. Because you know you're not supposed to use Wizard in game. You know you're not supposed to use ICM tools in game. But what we're doing is we're just locking in a couple ICM tools onto a sheet of paper or into our brain and memorizing them, which help us to basically determine what we can do in the majority of common situations that happen in a sit and go. All right. So we've spent a whole lot of time talking about what pivot points are. And the question is, why did we call it a pivot point? So once we know what a pivot point is, we can also adjust that pivot point to certain factors in the game. Like we were talking about earlier, there are players with extreme stats, somebody who's raising 70% of their hands pre-flop, or we're going to get other kinds of player reads, like the fact that somebody might be on tilt because they just lost a big all-in. We're going to be able to look at things like the bubble and the bubble factor. We're going to be able to look at stack size dynamics. And we're going to take all that information, and what we're going to do is we're going to incorporate it into our decision. But it turns out that what the pivot point does is it allows us to have not only the endpoints in the spectrum, it also gives us some guidance for how much we can adjust. And the thing is, beginning players tend to way over adjust. And what that does is it creates really volatile and unpredictable results. So they know things like, okay, I'm on the bubble, so I need to play tighter, but they really don't know how much tighter they need to play. Or they know that somebody's shoving loosely into them from the small blind, it's looser than normal, so they tend to respond way too, by calling way too loose. So the pivot point, what it does is it basically allows us to have a set point, which is like an anchor, which we pivot around. So say, for example, somebody's shoving 7.5 blinds on us, and we know exactly what our calling pivot point is. We also get guidance from what the other pivot points around it are to know how much is too much to adjust. We would never go beyond the 10 blind pivot point calling range, because that would be adjusting too much. So what we know is we can adjust around the 7.5 blind range, but the other pivot points that create the endpoints also tell us a little bit about how much is proper to adjust. And this is the major thing that I think advanced players do, probably without realizing it, is that they have some set ranges that kind of work for them. They don't identify them as pivot points, they just sort of know they work. And then after you get that set range, what they can then do is they have enough experience to know how much in certain situations you ought to adjust. And so they adjust very well. And this is why I say that pivot points are not going to stunt your play going from beginner to advanced player, because what's going to happen with the pivot point is the first level of the pivot point is going to be where you just learn how to play 7.5 blinds calling when somebody's shoving 7.5 blinds on you and they're a bad player. And then after you can get that foundation strategy down, then what you're going to do is you're going to start to realize that, hey, this guy is shoving way wide on me, I'm going to adjust and I'm going to go a little bit looser. But at least you always have that default pivot point to fall back on when all else fails or when you don't have any reads. All right. So pivot points can be used at a lot of points in a lot of places in a sit and go tournament. And so all we've talked about so far is what to do when we're calling shoves in the big blind. So there are a lot of spots that are actually worth examining, and we're going to talk about in future weeks. If you're excited about pivot points, I would say that you can go ahead and take a look at some of these things for yourselves right off the bat. So I'm going to give you some hints on some places that we can look at. One is, what are the ranges that we can open shove from different positions at the table for different size effective stacks? We just talked about this one. What about calling shoves? Well, we've given you some really good ranges for calling shoves from normal bad players, but what about, for example, when a loose player is shoving into you, or a player who plays like us, who's going to be shoving very wide in the small blind? A third and very important pivot point, which we're going to be talking about in this series, is a good pivot point for re-stealing when somebody's raised and we can 3-bet shove all in over them and try to steal those chips. And what about things like shoving on the bubble when we're shoving into a big stack versus when we're shoving into a shorter stack? Do we need some, pivot points which are going to help us adjust for the bubble? And what's going to happen when we're playing against good or bad players? Because obviously, the default ranges of a good player and a bad player are going to vary significantly in certain spots. All right. So a word of caution. Creating too many pivot points is actually going to be worse for your game than creating too few. So what we need is an optimum number of pivot points, because if you've got too many pivot points, then it's very hard to sort of look at a sheet full of numbers and different things and find the one that really most correctly represents your situation. For example, if I gave you a pivot point for every blind size shoved into us from 12 blinds, 11 blinds, 10 blind effective stacks, 9 blind effective stacks, 8 blind effective stacks, and we looked at every pivot point all the way down to 5 blinds that somebody could shove into us as a normal bad player, we'd have about 7 or 8 pivot points on the page, when really, in essence, all we need is 3, because we can sort of do a little mental math and adjust them in our head. So, if you wanted to go ahead and have 7 or 8 pivot points for calling, that's fine. But to me, that's too much of a cluttered system. I like to have a very nice, clean system where, there aren't that many decisions and there aren't that many things to look at, and we can make a decision fast. Because when we're multi-tabling, we're playing a lot of tables, and we got to make a decision in less than a few seconds. Having to refer to a sheet that's just jumbled full of information and hard to decipher is going to be worse for you than not having that information at all, because it's going to cause you not only not to think about the hand, it's also going to cause you to be, timing out on other hands because you're sifting through this sheet trying to basically find the right answer. It's the same thing that I feel actually about HUD stats, and it's actually something that I'm blogging about on the front page of DragtheBar right now, which is that sometimes having too much information at your disposal is actually worse than having not enough. So I call that information overload. And I would say that when we create this set of pivot points for a comprehensive strategy, what we need to do is we need to be careful to make sure that we don't create too many pivot points so that we never can use any of them effectively. So, in future weeks, we're going to be talking about sit and go strategy from scratch. It turns out that most of the red line decisions, the ones in Hold'em Manager that create our, all in EV, are basically going to be based on push-fold decisions. And it turns out that pivot points really work based best on push-fold decisions, because that's what creates a situation where the ranges and the decisions become fairly static. So we're going to be talking in future weeks about how to create and what a comprehensive set of pivot points actually is. A set that's basically going to take you and help you to make competently 90 or 95% of decisions at the table, just based on those pivot points. And so we're going to be starting from scratch. We're going to be talking about low blind, mid blind, and high blind play. We're talking about hopefully every topic that I think can make a really big impact on your game. And by the end of a few videos, what we should have done is taken you, hopefully, as a player who either is not winning or winning at a very low ROI, and turned you into the kind of player who knows how to make decisions correctly. And even for players who are winning but are fairly intuitive players, hopefully what we'll do is we'll create a sort of common language, frame of reference that we can discuss hands, not only in the forums and in the videos, but basically, away from those things if we ever chat online. And what this will allow us to do is have a nice common framework that we can all discuss hands in, and hopefully it'll take winning players and it'll help them look at the way that they play sit and goes and make decisions from a completely different angle. So I think there's a lot of value to basically any player who's watching these videos or is going to be watching these videos, and I hope that you will join me at the videos, and I would say until then, good luck at the tables, and I will see you next time.